Well, the instigation for this is that I've already been talking about the Internet of Things, and obviously an invited speaker talked about his house and all the fun with his house. Did anybody have a chance to see that? All the different objects in his house, like for instance, a person can sit outside his house and using Burp Suite intercept the communication between themselves and their garage door opener on their wireless network, and from that point on, they own that garage. And I'm sure every one of you puts a deadbolt lock inside their garage just in case the garage happens to be open really late at night. Now, I happen to have an autistic kid in my house, so I already had deadbolt locks everywhere. And fortunately, this kid never figured out the magic of removing screens from the windows. So I always make sure that I reduce the number of visible escape routes, put up guns, keep them all out of the way, the big knives. You get the idea. So there's a lot of things that I've done. And so my paranoid precautions, including also not letting anything on my house be IP addressable except the router, and trying to keep everything up to date. But if you're trying to automate your house, your home, the life around you, you're exposing yourself. Has anybody ever seen the movie IT?
No.
It's one of the wildest movies. It had one of the guys that played James Bond, the guy that also played in the one with the guy that played Scotty. It's that really funny actor that no. But yeah, it's Simon Pegg. He did. He played in a city where the crime rate was 0. That's because they were killing everybody and throwing them down in the sewers. Well, Timothy Dalton plays the main instigator of basically a new company, and he has an IT guy come by who happens to have all the answers to his problems. So he hires them without a background check. Well, this IT guy has a problem with authority. And it isn't before long before this guy creates a lot of issues. So it was speaking right up my alley. So I was already a little worried about this stuff. So you, as a security person, are going to be asked to look at IoT devices. It'll be the product that the company has, that they make. It's a product that they use. It's a protocol. All these things are going to be coming up in direct reaction to what's happening recently. Anybody actually have devices that are manufactured as part of your company's products, such as printers, sensors, any sort of like cameras or anything like that? Anybody in that situation? Now, anybody working in a company where they are using or purchasing sensors, alarm systems, and other types of devices? That's actually why I'm trying to target this. And the big problem is that even though this stuff has been around for a long time, putting it together is new. So I'm going to put it together a little bit. I'm going to look at it at a higher picture, and then I'm going to give a little bit in the AppSec area. So let's move forward. First of all, you thought about the dime attack. Just exactly how amazing that was, and how many consumer devices were brought to play, and how many things were destroyed, how many services were destroyed. How many people found that they couldn't do any work that day? Yep, link communications or Skype communications or other things. Well, it's because somebody posted this password list. And some people aren't stupid. They say, hey, wow, password list. I can log on to all these devices. I'm sure you've seen IP camera collections where you can jump into an IP camera. And if you're having trouble, that maybe there's a way to see maybe it's broken. Maybe the default password was actually what was on there. So this was the gateway by which that particular botnet was assembled. This is not an uncommon problem that is out there, because almost all the devices that are in use have default usernames and passwords and have other dozens of problems. So chances are, if you are a security person, it's going to be dumped on you. So here's some top 10 facts about IoT. Hate to kind of read this, but just want to give you some ideas of where we're coming from. Because I actually ran across this at least 4 or 5 years ago, before it actually became popular. They have many names. They've been around. And you probably are depending upon them in some way. This cell phone, got a cell phone. It is loaded with sensors. It is loaded with latent functionality, as I'll describe. How many people have Samsung appliances in your house? I tell you. Now, another thing that's going to be in common, I'm going to talk about this, is that it's just like when PCs first came out, everything was incompatible. There's no compatible security frameworks. Everybody has a different idea of what's important. Of course, they're too all-encompassing. And a lot of them look like NIST 800-53, if they do come out. Now, do you think that you could keep your job if you implemented more than 10% of NIST 800-53? You know what I'm talking about? The NIST standards that show up for like the state of Texas and various states. These are the top controls. You're lucky if you can get a quarter of them implemented in any way. And maybe even, not even encryption. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can try. And that, of course, that means that app security is a nightmare. And the number of devices that are out there is growing dramatically. Anybody remember Cosmos? Remember Carl Sagan used to say there are billions and billions of them out there. And he was just talking about stars and apparently galaxies. And that the company position, it's total chaos. Companies are popping up, they're merging, they're falling, they're jumping up and down. It's really difficult to look to a single authority. Could you actually name one expert who's the top person in the Internet of Things? Name one. Is there any person? I mean, we can talk about Bruce Schneier. He's the top person in cybersecurity, right? We can talk with, there's a couple of people that you can be fans of, sort of, but there's nobody that's in that position right now on Internet of Things. So it's actually, they're actually under full development under engineering companies. And also IoT is a lot about data. It's not really about serving you, though sometimes it is. And there's a lot of money coming into that. And I'll talk about that briefly. And then also, IoT is segmented to a lot of different industries. These industries don't talk to each other. They have some common suppliers, common consumers, but they are broken out, as I'll show you. There's a lot of good research, especially based in the European Union, but in other places, that shows you that there's a lot of work to do to bring these together. And that there is one area where IoT has been very successfully deployed and most dangerously deployed, and that's in industry. So, have they always been here? The answer is yes, and in a really big way. Has anybody ever dealt with a Zigbee controller? Right? How long do the batteries last? When did you last change your batteries? Right? Right? Bluetooth is also used a lot for controlling AC controllers. We're talking about every single little AC device, air conditioning device out in the enterprise has a little controller, and it either has the low power Zigbee or slightly high power Bluetooth, or it has higher power and more accessible TCP/IP. You have Mercedes-Benz. You've been able to control those remotely from satellite for almost a decade. That's been built-in functionality. There's a lot of vehicles now that you can control remotely. As Mr. Apple hacker, what's his name, Charlie Miller? Yeah, he can actually send you out careening off the road at will. You might not want to be in that vehicle when he's trying that out. Has anybody heard of X.10? They're still around. I pulled mine out of the box. Been there about 8 years. I lost a drone, so I actually had to put my camera up on the roof and start looking around. The stupid thing still worked. And I was able to activate it and use it, hook it up to the TV, and start searching for my devices. Do you realize that there have been many pipeline spills out there in the world caused by pipeline control devices that are spaced at different intervals along pipelines, and that those can actually affect the flow of the fuel along those pipes? They've been out there for decades, at least 2 decades, and many of them are accessible through radio. Of course, we got telematics. Why is it that you see truck drivers sleep in the parking lot? Because their computers in their trucks tattle on them and tell them they can't drive any more than, 12 hours? Is that the maximum they're allowed to drive? I mean, if I were a truck driver, I want to drive 24 hours a day and sleep maybe like about 3 hours every other week. I'd be making a lot more money, but the accident rate goes up dramatically. And that's a federal requirement. And there's a telematic device under each of the car seats in your vehicle. They don't necessarily transmit outwardly, but you can pull a lot of information off of it. And there's a lot of protocols out there. And there's certain subscription services now. And also, there's a lot of things that are being developed right now that are almost, it's so overwhelming, it's almost impossible to observe. All this stuff has been happening under our noses in terms of bringing it together within the last 2 to 3 years. But the devices themselves have been out at least 2 decades. It's really positively amazing what it is that's happening in that area. So the very first time I ran across an IoT device, has anybody ever heard of Loytech.com? If you crawl up into the roof of this building, chances are you're going to find a little device about this big. It will have power, an Ethernet connection, and a connection to that thing that just set the motor off in this room. This technology has been in use for at least 2 decades. And their devices look similar to this. And they have a web interface. The one that I looked at had a version of Linux dated 2007 on it. Was using HTTP protocol, and I found almost 100 devices. I said, what in the world are these? So I finally found them, and they looked like that they had pigeons poop on them. They'd been sitting out there so long. So imagine, and each one of these devices can be hijacked and used for some purpose that's not appropriate, just as happened with the DIN attack. The only thing protecting those devices was whether or not the firewall, the perimeter firewall at a particular facility, was blocking communications originating from outside to servers within. If any of those ports were open, port 80 or 443, were open to an external attack, or you could originate an attack from an infected machine and open up all those ports, that entire site would belong to an outside party. So that's pretty creepy. So of course the central controller was also just as interesting, because many times that would be a single Windows 7 system left alone with technicians monitored overnight, night after night, where you leave these guys alone with computers with full administrative access while sitting on the internet. And you know what happens to computers when people start getting left alone with their machines for a long period of time. You know, guys in their 40s and 50s and everything. So that was the first thing, is that we had to clean the computer up. So there's other things where IoT has happened. Where that insulin pumps actually are controllable. They're IP addressable. Medical devices, you've actually heard in Hacker News literally today, thousands of operations have had to be canceled due to hacking within hospitals. This is the kind of stuff that's affected. Car washes have sensors that report to a central controller, which activates each of these devices in sequence. Of course, Stuxnet. There was a German steel mill, and that there was a dam that actually was forced to release its contents. These, by the way, these come from the RSA conference. And then there are other devices, electric car chargers. How about pacemakers? Are you aware that pacemakers have had protocols for external control, at least for 2 decades, and now they're moving more to the modern age. They're using protocols that you're more likely to have in your hands or on your cell phone to control. That's very comforting. And of course, the smartwatches, which I'm not sure they're going to make it for the long term, but we'll see. So, and there's other areas of IoT that are very important, besides IP cameras, which of course we already talked about. The kinds of things, including like washers, refrigerators, automobiles, lamps, cell phones, light bulbs, RFID. What about nanotechnology? Did I miss anything? It's a little bit of everything. So, if it's everywhere, is it a threat? So the answer is it could be. And is you also aware that many of those functions may actually just simply be latent functionality? By latent, I mean that the functions have not been implemented, but the hardware is there to do it. You know, your cell phones, your Apples and your Androids have an FM radio built into them. All you have to do is plug headset into it, put the next application on it, and next thing you know, you're listening to all local radio stations, and they also download advertisements. So they're pulling in information on multiple channels. That's kind of crazy. So let's do with the definition, and then we'll move to more formal definition. The guy that was talking previously, he talked about Internet of Things as referring to things and devices, but actually it is the next level. It refers to when you have machines communicating directly with machines. You have machines connecting with cloud servers, machines talking to other servers or other devices for the purpose of automating things. There's other functions, such as, for instance, you've heard of cyber physical systems. Have any of you guys actually seen that description? Pass up some little esoteric looking guide that says cyber physical system security. That's one of them. They're also called ICS, intelligence systems. They're all the same thing. There's a lot of sources for that, and I really strongly recommend that you not only go to Verizon, but that you also go and take a look at the documentation that's been put together at the European Union. These guys have been doing a very good job. I'll show you the reference, and this gives a pretty complete explanation. Look at the growth rate. I think this is wrong. I believe we actually have many more devices than this that are currently out there throughout the entire world. Consider the number of attacks that came in through DIN, and then consider the future attacks that will occur, because these devices have yet to be discovered. So, all I'm going to mention here is that there's really good reason for these devices to be growing. It's not just convenience. There's money in it. Think about what IoT devices are doing. They're sensing, they're transporting information, they're storing it, they're analyzing, controlling, and they're sharing. That information is then pulled together and sold. I have a different presentation where I actually show the direct link to what is called big data analytics, where that data then is sold in blocks, and that's actually how you can monetize. For instance, how many times you push the refresh button on your Samsung washing machine for a particular brand of soap. Samsung wants to know how many millions of people pushed a button for Tide versus pushing the button for another brand. They need to know that information, and they get a percentage of the revenue as well as the people that were actually gathering that data together. So these devices everywhere, and this applies just as much to insulin pumps and their aggregate functions, as well as pacemakers, as well as oil fields. But unfortunately, this has been a problem from the very beginning. Security is definitely not a priority. functionality in sales. And security is rarely a requirement, but it ought to be. And you would think that with all this information available about IoT, that there would be people kind of would have them classified in the same way, but they don't. So has anybody heard what a taxonomy is? Okay, who doesn't know what a taxonomy is? Taxonomy actually describes how you break things down, on how you describe them, how you identify suppliers. Let me show you a taxonomy. Well, that's kind of fun, isn't it? Looks a little busy. This is a typical taxonomy that easily obtainable, and I'll provide the reference for that. So let me blow this up for you. There you go. Application verticals. What they mean is that these are the devices and brands that apply to different areas, and then down on the horizontals, these are the platforms that are in use. It's kind of difficult to see the logos, but do you recognize any of those logos? There are literally thousands of companies that are building these devices out there right now. Do you remember that? Who saw the presentation across the hall? Oak Room. Canary. Yeah, right. Canary. There you go. There's one. Let's see. Who else? Let's see. Nadanova, Bistro, Rolly Catch. All right. Let's see if we can get blow it up a little more. Oh, by the way, if you really want to get this in clear resolution, you'll have to pay about $10,000. So that's one of the other fun things about it. These companies that put these things together, they really know how to stick you. Recognize any logos yet? TomTom, right here. Did you know they make fitness equipment? So next time you're in the gymnasium and you're doing your stuff and you hook yourself up to the device, it's sharing that information somewhere. It's probably health information, health-related information. Garmin is doing it. What does Garmin do with that information? As they gather information about you and where you're going and where you're making GPS inquiries, they're identifying the size of the market that you guys are developing. How many folks have a GPS device that they bought that's in their vehicle? How about built in? Right, is in your phone too. So we used to have them separately. Now Garmin, to survive, has now made contracts, I'm sure, with many auto companies to make sure those GPS devices are now involved. Now look at the platforms. Recognize any of them at all? These platforms are really, how would I say, what you see today will be gone tomorrow, but these platforms are growing quite dramatically. Sorry to overwhelm you, this is a lot of information, but I wanted to do kind of something differently than what the other guy had done. He was talking about a specific case study. I want to show you that this is not just big. This is massive. This is huge. This is basically life-changing. This is civilization-changing. We're depending upon things. We have no idea who they are. We have no idea where this stuff is coming from. And the number one thing, they're not addressing security. But Gartner does have something to say about that. So there are some shared suppliers, and there's one area to look out for, is that some companies have figured out how to pull them together, and that if you really want to pay $5,000 to $10,000, you're certainly free to go and get an up-to-date taxonomy from IDC.com. So here, just note that, www.idc.com. They will have that taxonomy available for about $4,000. They'll provide the 2014 taxonomy. They might even be charging more because now they're creating different views. So here's IoT by the numbers. This is the growth rate. Note the areas. I'll just go through these and see which ones you guys are in. How many guys are in manufacturing? Making things, right? How about finance or insurance? How about media and entertainment? All right, home monitoring. devices. You sell them, maintain them, all right? Retail and hospitality, right? Transportation distribution. We're talking about trucks, pipelines, all that kind of stuff. Energy and utilities. Public sector, that includes government. And healthcare and pharma. So literally, somebody here is going to be affected, and if you're not a security professional, you may, or even if you're not in these fields, it may be thrown in front of you anyway. Now, the Verizon Enterprise report was really pretty amazing. But Goldman Sachs did an even better job of this. Seen that graph before? Think of concentric circles of effect around you. What do you have right now? You got your phones, right? And then the next step is that you have your vehicles, cars, trucks, and buses. All these items have some sort of device in them. Most vehicles, unless your vehicle was made, say before like 2002, you think they actually have wired harnesses connecting devices together? They have wireless networks within them, increasingly. So for a newer vehicle, you're not going to be able to find any wiring harnesses except for the battery to the main computer controller, and that's going to be about it. And then with your homes, such as the smart home, remember the movie IT that I told you about, which was kind of creepy? This is what that one was all about. That was a pretty interesting theme, too. And he also messed up the company, and also tried to hack the SEC so that their IPO was destroyed, which makes it really interesting. You guys know what an IPO is. The guy was waiting to get his billions of dollars for his company, basically an airplane-based, ride-sharing kind of company. And right when he was waiting for the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, to bring him his money, that came up and said, "Sir, I need to talk to you for a minute. We have a problem." That's probably not something that you want to hear, is that apparently one of your people has attempted to threaten our organization, and you're now under investigation. So that's not a fun thing. Smart towns and cities. How many people have a smart meter on their house? That means something they just put on fairly recently, to at least measure your electricity use. So if you want to do a mad scientist lab inside of your house, you're probably going to have to think twice about that now. I'm sorry to say it's not going to fly anymore, because if you do that, they'll catch you. And of course in retail, and I'll go a little bit into the transportation area, and then finally industrial. And look at all the areas that are covered. So thank Goldman Sachs, and I would recommend you read the report thoroughly. Okay. Next area I want to talk about is that there is Beecham Research has a different taxonomy that I would like you to, if you have a chance, to look them up. And just type this in, and this is something that I'd like you to note. They break it out in a different way. These look more like the maps you'll see, like if you've ever worked with Northrop Grumman or any one of those other main defense contractors. They lay it out by sectors, which includes the service sector covered, the application group, locations where applicable, and the types of devices that are applied. Just simply in the transportation area. What they mean by that is, for instance, just simply covering automobiles, operations, telematics, navigation, diagnostics, stolen vehicles, door locks, and amenities. How many people have had to actually have your car unlocked, and the locksmith actually had to do an electronic code to get your car unlocked because you lost your opener? I had mine melt, so that was pretty bad. And of course, aircraft, ships, and trains. And for instance, are you aware that every cargo container now has the device inside of it? And literally every item within that cargo container can be tracked? They had an entire facility completely taken over in Denmark, and of course also in Iran. And for an entire year, the government of Iran lost complete control of all their cargo and their shipping. They had no idea. Yeah.
Wasn't there a recent event where some like Somali pirates who were in league with a hacker who was hacked into the database and
That's exactly the similar thing.
So they knew which containers to target.
That's exactly the thing. That's the reason you have this disappearing cargo and cargo containers. Well, the Iran thing was probably a state-originated attack, where if you lost track of your shipping, you probably can't get those appropriate parts to the right places. And that basically shut down the entire government, but it also happened in Denmark and some other locations where you could basically go through and clean out the cargo at will. You just decide what you're going to steal, and people would not know the better until the cargo did show up, and then the insurance company would cover it. And then, of course, we have these things, tracking, signage, and tolls. I'm sure many of you have experienced variable tolls, and that they're able to track you. Right now, it's by your picture and your driver's license plate, but eventually that's going to be the electronic signature of your vehicle. And the number of exceptions and all that are involved with that, that's really positively amazing. So all these areas are exposed. So just simply in the automobile area, we're just talking one area. These are all the things that are controlled by IoT. Anybody in the transportation industry? So this is like even the city of Austin. Think about all the different things that they have to think about in order to ensure that the trains stop, that the traffic lights and traffic signals, the warning lights, the amber alerts, that the cargo gets delivered to the appropriate place, affected by private industries such as, for instance, Amazon, UPS, as well as also making sure that the buses get on the right routes and they show up at the right time. All these areas are affected. So with that context, let's get to the security issues and then the AppSec areas. So the biggest one is that, is your area threatened? Is there interest in making your life difficult or stealing from your area? I think we've kind of shown that in shipping, that's a pretty big area. And then another area that's very common is the extreme use of open source components. Now, some companies, you know, Daimler-Benz, that's Chrysler Daimler. Well, Mercedes, part of it, used their own technology, and they wrote their own code. Well, how many people have heard of a Mercedes-Benz getting hacked? On the other hand, Chrysler, Daimler, they use open source equipment, as well as also Jeep and other companies, and they got hacked because they use open source software components, which made it very easy to determine the vulnerabilities. One of the problems also is, when's the last time you patched your car? When you bring your car into the auto shop, are they actually upgrading the firmware on your device? Now, what if you enhance your vehicle? I guess that's a different problem. You know, if you change out the CPU, then you've created a piece of scrap. And then there's also compliance requirements. Do you think that having government being involved with IoT is going to help? Yeah. What if they said the death penalty for causing somebody to wreck their car by messing with their vehicle? Nobody would be afraid. Nobody would dare touch a vehicle again, because if they made a mistake, you could accuse them of having engaged in sabotage. So there's got to be a different way to approach it. It's not going to be easy. And of course, malware and botnets. And as I said, it's already deployed. Security framework issue that I've already mentioned. And here's one of the things. IoT devices are engineered devices. Any engineers in here? Well, I'll tell you a principle in engineering. When you engineer it for a lifetime. It has a specific lifetime, like you build a bridge. It's built for 20 to 30 years with specific maintenance. But it's built to last through a service life. IT and the foundations of IoT devices are not engineering grade components, unless it's like Mercedes-Benz or a company that protects its trade secrets really well. So Do you guys understand the distinction between technology and engineering? Engineering is built to serve the public for a service lifetime. IoT devices are using non-engineering grade components with some exceptions. What you have then is that you have inferior quality, even though it's not always the fault of the people that are there, against something where life and safety are at play. So things will happen. There's a consequence of that. And then, of course, we have the hard-coded default passwords, which is not a very good engineering practice. And just throwing in another one, they happen to be everywhere. Look at your light bulbs. They even have that. So has anybody ever seen a threat heat map before? The amount of effort. If I knew that I could get hundreds of millions of dollars by redirecting cargo to the appropriate places without just simply following the UPS truck around, and that I could actually find out what was in those vehicles or what was available, where the monetization was occurring, you think that there might be the opportunity to put a little bit of effort into some of these? So this is where the script kiddies are. By the way, you can look this reference up. I have this available. And or are we talking about having up to hundreds of people involved? Many of these devices, such as, for instance, what was involved with Stuxnet, probably took several years to build and had probably a few dozens of people on the team, state sponsorship, multiple international people. And the whole point was to make the centrifuge blow up. You remember that? They made the centrifuge blow up, but providing false information to the main sensor panel. This is the kind of thing that we're facing right now. But it used to be endpoints. It used to be servers and data. Now it's actually the devices that actually are directly affecting our lives. What would happen, for instance, if you had a refrigerator on the internet that was storing medical supplies? What happens to insulin when it gets above 70 degrees? What color does it turn? Anybody know? It gets cloudy. If insulin goes above 70 degrees and then you actually keep it there and then turn it back down to its appropriate temperature, does insulin stay cloudy? No, it doesn't. It becomes poison. You can do that to anything. You can do that to any pharmaceutical, any device. You can do that to explosives or anything. So this is really the issue. So here's the losses. People, at least right now, people's lives have been affected. We've lost, like, surgeries, operations, and other things have occurred. We've talked about cargo, car thefts, drones, pipelines, drug contamination, data breaches, hijacking, sabotage, and lost revenue. This is just the start. Hopefully, at least I gave you a chance to open up that idea. So, where are we right now? These are just some of the questions when you have this dumped into your lap to think about. And I'm going to share this. Is that what protocols are going to be in use? Didn't I show at least 4 different protocols depending upon the speed of communication of the device? All right. Who is the ultimate end consumer? Does this send this information to servers, peoples, regulators, or is this for aggregating data? What was the technology that built the device? You're aware now these days that there are dozens of emulators. IBM, who's heard of IBM Watson? IBM Watson is an IoT simulator that can simulate dozens of devices with different components in it. Who else deals with that? Doesn't VMware have one now? I think Dell is doing something, and there's at least another 40, 50 companies.
Upboard.
Who does?
It's called Upboard.
Upboard. 40, 50 companies, plus you can do your own if you're playing with Raspberry Pis and other devices. Now, how is the access obtained to the device? Is it an API, REST API? Is it open ports? Is it handshake or certificates? Who built it? Is there a developer out there that you can talk to? If you have a device that's dumped in your hands, what does it do? I mean, how do you get to it? What are its functions? These are things that you'll have to ask as a security tester. Can you get source code for it? Well, if it's open source, of course, you probably can very easily. But if it's proprietary, well, you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement to get your hands on it. And then what are the threat levels for those? And I'm sure you're aware that Shodan has a very nice database. And what's the impact? If this device is actually misconfigured, are you just simply going to make a room a little uncomfortable? Or are you going to bust open a pipeline and dump 50,000 gallons of gasoline, which has actually occurred? Fortunately, nobody got hurt, but that's a very big pain. And that are these devices exposed? Are they segmented? Have you heard that in many cases, companies that, for instance, have pipelines, say, for instance, they have their industrial control devices for factory A, if they own that. For factory B, they decided to save some money, so they outsource the network to another party. And it's not segmented in the same segment as the other one. So these devices in the secondary factory or pipeline may be actually accessible from outside. That's a nice thing to do. And that where's the data collected, and how's it stored? Can you get onto the device and corrupt it? Can you tell a train that its temperature is different than what it is? For instance, a train sensor and cause a train to crash through the train station. Those are the little questions. And then what's the business criticality of the data that's being gathered? Is this just simply one device and it ignores the outliers? Or is it actually pulling together all the devices at once? And what's the potential impact of life overall? And as I mentioned, the train example. So here's some tips. Treat every IoT device as a server that is waiting to get out and infect the world. You just have to assume right now that they're dangerous. There is a guide. There's some guides, and I'll mention the reference for it, that will help a little bit, but it's just a start. You definitely need to understand the functions and interfaces of that device as quickly as you can. The OWASP testing guide is a start, but it's not really quite yet designed for IoT. Did anybody see the OAT presentation about Autobots, about botnets? It turns out that was actually very useful. I wish I wrote that down, but written that down. That may be a start. OWASP is actually starting to put together taxonomies of attacks and exploitation. It turns out that the botnet taxonomy is actually helpful because IoT devices can be misconfigured or redirected to a non-benevolent purpose very easily. And it also, can you even use a proxy like Wireshark or a WinPCAP card? Or are you going to have to use a fancier device in order to look at it? So Wireshark is very impressive, and there's other protocol analyzers. But give me a typical price of a protocol analyzer outside of a WinPCAP card. WinPCAP device, how much is that? $400? Wireshark, free, right? What's the next best protocol analyzer? How much you got to pay for that?
A couple million, that's out.
Exactly. You know, 50,000, 100,000. That's just not going to be easy. Can you tell them that, oh, I want you to examine this, but could you please give me a budget of $2 million? I mean, how many IoT testing labs you know that are out there? They're very, very far between and rare. And but it is possible if it uses TCP/IP or one of those protocols. Maybe you can actually ARP poison it, or you might be able to implement a proxy. So, simplest thing you can do right now, I learned this from one guy, is that definitely at least try to look it up in the catalog where it came from. You might look out. That's how I found the locate devices, and that it might be written in Japanese or Arabic or something. So if the device in the United States, if the manual in the United States is locked up, well, you know, who cares if it's written in Arabic or whatever? At least you'll understand part of it. Google Translate's okay for technical terms. It might suck for idiomatic phrases, but what if it's came from Thailand, it's written only in Thai? At least you might get an idea what the device does. Try to find the developers or engineers, especially if there's a high impact. You know, you may be communicating with them using Google Translate. Maybe the language is in Hungarian or something like that. And given the direction that things are going, it may end up being written in Georgian. Does anybody know where Tbilisi, Georgia is? They have an entire manufacturing center that will be originating stuff that will be spreading throughout all of Central Asia, eastward and westward. Can you imagine trying to parse an IoT device used to control enterprise air conditioning that came from that part of the world? And of course, the manual's helpful. And number one thing, and I recommend going to the testing guides that are presented by Solutionary. Use that device safely. You can't trust them until you understand its functions, know where its code came from, know its interfaces, what protocols it uses. So unless you know everything about that device, you have to treat it as a hostile device. It may have a botnet on it. It may have bad code. It may actually control something. One of my friends was playing with Bluetooth protocols trying to test a printer. He killed all the air conditioners in the building. They didn't even know why the air conditioners kept on going out. I mean, you just have to watch out for this kind of thing. And it was in the middle of summer. It's getting a little warm. And there have been security frameworks proposed for IoT. Keep your eyes open. Some of them are quite credible. For instance, Cisco, CSC, MITRE, and others. European Union is definitely doing a lot there. If Brexit occurs, they may stop writing them in English, though. So you'll have to either read French or have to start translating, and that translates better in Spanish. Those translate better than some of the other languages. And that OWASP is going to be doing a lot, but there's only so much they can do, and there's so much that governments can do. There's very little. If the penalties are too extreme on compliance, it'll slow compliance down. The penalties for exploitation, the people that are committing these crimes, it takes months and years to track them down. They eventually get theirs. Meanwhile, there's an entire new group of people that's out there that's waiting to exploit things. And there are many other publishers that are out there. So keeping up with it, the information's there, but you have to put it together for your field. So as you can see, there's many frameworks, simple search, and then I got at least another 20 pages. So, understand a little bit better the threat taxonomy, at least get an idea of the different ways that you can attack IoT devices, and understand a little bit better what you're looking for in terms of what might be required in the security requirements, especially if you can actually become involved with the testing and development process early on. So if you're working with developers, there was a presentation in Brazil, and there's many other ones that actually talked about here are the minimum requirements that IoT devices should consider, and if you can get in there earlier, you can actually become more embedded in the development teams, and you can actually discuss with them. What do you do about default passwords? What do you do about upgrades? What do you do about memory segmentation and protection? What if somebody has control of the device? What does the device do? So these are all questions that are worth answering. So eventually, there will be governance and standards. Privacy might even come into play. They're going to force it on you in European Union, of course. More secure systems engineering methods, better threat models. And remember, there was a comment that was made in one of the keynote speeches. Ask the engineers how these things can be attacked. Start with them. That's a much stronger approach, and that implement security in layers. At the very minimum, treat IoT devices as untrusted devices so that you're sure that at least they can't harm anything else. And then also, how long are these devices supposed to last? They say they're supposed to last a decade. Well, what if the life cycle really needs to be 2 years because of how fast the technology is changing? And then, of course, how do you ensure continued authorization and audit, and that increase awareness on them? And of course, I think that Gartner did predict that the top area for IoT was security. And I think we were right on the money on that one. So The sum of it all is that they're everywhere. Security is an afterthought. Look at certification of the devices, standards and taxonomies. Those old devices are going to be around, but there are subscription services that are out there that are able to gather some of them together and actually help you manage them a little better. If you are interested in IoT security, the more hands-on experience you can get, the better. Raspberry Pis, Arduino, simulators, whichever way you can do it. The more you become aware of, the more you'll be prepared to deliver recommendations to the developers, or at least to your organization, or at least use your organization's leverage in not buying 10,000 or 100,000 devices because they're of the security level of those devices. So these things, it's very important to think about the new era that we're in. So I do have some references and links. I'll update them. And if you have any questions, just let me know. And here's my contact. Any quick questions? A lot of information. Sorry to overwhelm you. I would really get started with taxonomies. Just understand where the devices are appearing and what applications they are being used for, so that you can see where it may actually apply to you. So the next time you have a device dumped on your lap and you're asked the question, what are the security issues with that device, you may be able to answer it. I will thank you very much.